140 some people. We'll turn it over now to Eric Anderson. Eric is our Vice President and also Co-Chair of Programs. He'll introduce our speaker, Eric Anderson.
Well, that's kind, but I haven't done anything, so. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this year's beginning program, inaugural program for the Audubon Public Series here. This year we've got an incredible array of different speakers coming that are going to cover topics everywhere from local environmental issues to those that happen on a global scale. So we'll be hearing someone come in and talk about the future of Wisconsin's forests in the face of climate change and invasive species, where it will be and what it will look like, 15 to 50 years from now. We're also going to have someone come in at the end and talk about the global decline of insects and what the impacts are going to be on the ecosystems around the planet based on that. And I think you'll find that there's a lot of fascinating things that are coming forward in the next few months. So look for this week every month of the year except for December, and you'll find a program going on. Later this week, I will climb on an airplane with my wife and fly to Germany and visit the homestead of my mother. The trip's going to cover thousands of miles, and if my coordinates are correct about it, and if my GPS works, we will end up in a little tiny town called Schmuckhausen in former East Germany. Okay, my mother is long since passed, and the only way I'm going to be able to find this is the fact that she kept meticulous notes and the fact that we've got this incredible technology available that will dump me in the right place, I think. Okay. What does this have to do with tonight's program? I'll tell you, it's quite remarkable. It has plenty to do with tonight's program. What we're seeing going on right now in Wisconsin are the flights of the monarchs as they have gathered together after going through 4 generations from the time that they left their migration site in Mexico. Now, it's a small area in Mexico that they all travel to. And if everybody dies out and you are the 4th generation here in Wisconsin, there is nobody to talk to about how you get to where you're going. So these things are hardwired in their brain, not only where they're going, the map of it, but also hardwired in terms of knowing where they are at any moment in time so they can navigate themselves to that correct location. That is a phenomenal thing to be able to do. And it's just one of the aspects of the biology of this species that we're going to hear a lot about tonight. So let me just take a moment and tell you a little bit about our speaker for this evening, Dr. Karen Oberhauser. She's the director of the UW-Madison Arboretum currently, and she and her students have been conducting research on several aspects of monarch butterfly ecology. And she's actually been responsible for this nationwide citizen science project called the Monarch Larva Monitoring Project, which engages hundreds of volunteers every year. By the way, how many people out in the audience are engaged in that or part of that project? Excellent, great, all right, wonderful. Karen herself has authored more than 90 different papers on research on monarchs and on insect conservation and on the whole arena of citizen science. Karen's extremely passionate about her conservation of the world's biodiversity, and she believes that the connection her projects and the Arboretum promote between humans and the natural world promote meaningful conservation action, which is exactly what the Audubon Society is all about as well in terms of educating and motivating action. She's the chair of the Monarch Joint Venture and a founding officer of the Monarch Butterfly Fund. And in 2013, Karen received a White House Champion of Change Award for her work with citizen science. Would you all please help me in bidding a warm welcome to Karen Overhauser?
Thank you for that kind introduction, Eric. And can everyone hear me okay? I feel like I'm blasting out, so I can hear myself really well. Yeah, as Eric said, I've been studying monarchs for a long time, since 1985, to be exact. And I know a lot about monarchs. I know the things we know about monarchs, and I know a lot of things we don't know about monarchs. So I love it that Eric talks about the migration and the fact that they do probably know where they are at any given point in time. We're not 100% sure of that. We don't know how they know where they are at any given point in time, but there are just a lot of great mysteries about monarchs, which is one of the reasons they've kept me fascinated for so long, all of my career. So there are kind of 2 points to tonight's talk, and one is apparent in the title, Monarch Conservation, All Hands on Deck. That means that in order to preserve monarchs, all sectors of society will need to be involved. This is not something that can just be done by a few of us. And the other main point I want to make is also, as Eric said in his introduction, one of the great things for me about monarchs is the fact that so many people care about them. The fact that you're all here. How many people in this room, even if you haven't seen that picture, would recognize a monarch butterfly if it flew in front of your car? All right, most people. How many people in this room would recognize a monarch caterpillar? Okay, a few people are raising their hands. About 2/3 of you raise your hands for that. How many people would recognize the caterpillar of another, or the larva of another insect species, and know what species it was? All right, we've got a handful. So what would you recognize?
Oh, lots of them.
Okay.
Cecropia, Polyphemus.
Okay, so we got another caterpillar raiser. I love to raise Cecropias too. So who else would recognize one? Now you know I'm going to put you on the spot. Who else raised their hand if you think of it? Yes, what would you recognize?
The Cecropia.
The Cecropia, okay. Anything besides Cecropias and Lunas and Polyphemus?
Swallowtail.
Which one?
Swallowtail.
Which kind of swallowtail?
Eastern tiger.
Eastern tiger swallowtail. Great. So a few. But the point is that there are somewhere between 1 and 10 million species in the world, and probably more people recognize monarchs to species than anything else. So for me, as my research has become more and more focused on conservation instead of the nitty-gritty details of monarch biology, which I am still incredibly fascinated by, now I do almost 100% conservation. And monarchs are this amazing tool because people know them, people are interested in them, and people are interested in saving them. And when we work to save monarchs, a lot of other things come along for the ride. So that's kind of the second point of tonight. And I want to start because I'm probably going to run out of time at the end. So I really want to I really stand on the shoulders of giants here. So I'm going to talk about a lot of different research, a lot of things we understand and don't understand about monarchs. And these are some of the people who have been involved in helping me learn about monarchs. First of all, I was at the University of Minnesota for most of my career as a graduate student and a faculty member, assistant professor, associate, full professor at Minnesota. I just came to Wisconsin 2 years ago and had amazing students and staff. So this is the last team I worked with at the University of Minnesota, just incredible students that I've had throughout my career. This is my new academic family at the Arboretum. We do a lot of conservation work at the Arboretum, and I'm even pulling them into the monarch world, which is a lot of fun. And finally, citizen scientists. Recognizing here my parents, my mother is here in the audience in the front row, you can meet her afterwards. But they're representing all citizen scientists who collect data on monarch butterflies, and it's because of the work of all of these citizen scientists that we know so much about monarchs. We don't know everything, but we know a lot. We probably know more about monarchs than any other non-pest insect. We tend to study the pest insects a lot, but we know a lot about monarchs thanks to citizen scientists. How many people in here have collected citizen science data on monarchs? Okay, a handful of you, so maybe after tonight we'll have a few more wanting to do that. All right, so here we go, talking about monarchs. So first of all, I'm going to talk about the life history of monarchs to give you a little bit of this fascinating biology. And this is the part where you'll probably have questions, and I'm totally fine with you interrupting me. Okay, so just raise your hand, and if I don't see you, just wiggle your hand, and we'll get those questions out of the way. So, and I can see a clock back there, so I'll be pretty good at gauging how we're doing at time, and I might cut us off. So feel free to ask questions during this part when we're talking about the life history of monarchs. So when I think about the life history of monarchs, I think of two cycles. And one is the individual life cycle that all organisms go through. All of us did. Started out as an egg and we age. So we're going to talk about that just briefly for monarchs. So monarchs start out their individual lives as eggs. The eggs are laid only on milkweed plants. Caterpillars only eat milkweed. There are many species of milkweed, and they'll eat most of them, but the females find milkweed plants, lay their eggs usually on the bottom of the leaf. So this picture is really upside down, but it just looks funny if you put it the other way. So here's the egg. It's about the size of a pinhead, and the caterpillar hatches from the egg after 4 to 5 days under normal summer conditions. If it's cooler, it will take longer. So I've done a lot of experiments in different temperatures, and an egg can last 20 days if you put it in really cold conditions. So they can develop more slowly when it's cold, but this is pretty normal. The caterpillar hatches out of the egg, and they're a caterpillar for 9 to 13 days, again under normal summer conditions. It can be stretched out. It doesn't get a lot shorter than that. And during this time, the caterpillars molt or shed their skin 5 times and grow in mass about 2,000 times. So in 10 days, they get 2,000 times heavier. Okay, so that's the caterpillar larva stage. I once heard somebody say, I was at a talk at a nature center, and the person got kind of offended when people said caterpillar instead of larva. I am totally fine saying caterpillar. Actually, caterpillar is a little more exact because a caterpillar is the larva of a butterfly or moth. So it's really a more exact term than larva. Because a larva is for all different kinds of insects. So I will not be offended if you say caterpillar. The next stage is the chrysalis or the pupa stage. And it's a pupa, if we kept it under exactly the same temperature conditions, it would be a pupa for about 1 day less than the caterpillar. So here's the pupa, a very beautiful stage of monarchs, and when you're raising them, the easiest stage because you don't need to feed them. So this is the pupa. It's a little over 1 inch long, and you can just see there's an egg there for scale right next to that one. And then we get the adult, and then the cycle starts again. So we're thinking about time that they're in each stage. So the adult is an adult for 2 to 6 weeks if it's a non-migratory, if it's in a non-migratory generation. We actually don't know how long they live in the wild. This is based on captive studies. So, you know, nobody has tracked an individual monarch in the wild for their whole life, but in captivity it's 2 to 6 weeks. The ones that migrate, and I'll talk about that in a second, live 8 to 9 months, so they live a lot longer. And sometimes we think, oh, I'd really like to be a monarch in the migratory generation because I would live so much longer than a non-migrant. The problem is that those migratory butterflies, the ones you're seeing out there now, have to wait until next spring to mate and lay eggs. So they have to survive a long time. A lot of them don't make it, so they never get to have offspring. Where these guys, the ones that live 2 to 6 weeks, are about 4 to 5 days old before they mate and lay eggs. So it's a little less risky to be an adult in that generation, or those generations that don't migrate. All right, are we good here on this individual life cycle? No questions? All right. So I said monarchs only eat milkweed as caterpillars. But there are lots of native milkweed species in North America, over 100 species. We have 12 species in Wisconsin. You can look, if you want to see a list of all those, you go to a website called the Wisconsin Monarch Collaborative. And you can get a handout of all 12 species that we have in Wisconsin. This, it kind of, oopsie, sorry. Oh, you saw it's coming up. Here are some of our native milkweed species here. This is whorled milkweed, or Asclepias verticillata. Common milkweed, which is the one you see all over in ditches and maybe your yard. Asclepias syriaca. This is swamp milkweed, another one native to here. Incarnata butterfly weed, Asclepias tuberosa. And then there are some really great species in other places. This is Asclepias subulata, which grows in Arizona. It's one of my favorite milkweeds because it has no leaves. All of the photosynthesizing is done in the stems, and the caterpillars will actually eat the stems of this, it's called desert milkweed, Asclepias subulata. This is Asclepias viridis, which grows kind of through the middle, right here in the United States. This is showy milkweed, which is really closely related to common milkweed. It grows in the west and even into the western part of Minnesota. So really varied morphology of all of these different milkweed species, but they all have the same flower shape, so that brings them together. They used to be their own family. They got lumped into the family with the dog banes, Apostanaceae, but they are kind of different from dog bane. And you might read somewhere that monarchs eat dog bane, but they don't. Only eat milkweeds and a few other species that used to be in their same family. All right. So that was what the caterpillars eat. Now let's focus a little bit on the monarchs. And how many people in here know which one of these is a male and which one is a female? See how much you already know about monarchs? So which one is the male?
The right one.
Yeah, the right one. And how can you tell that?
The dots.
Yeah, these two dots make this one a male. These are specialized scales. They're called androconial scales. And those scales are kind of hollowed out. And in close relatives of monarchs, the male emits a chemical called a pheromone through those androconial patches, so there's androconial scales, to attract the female. We think that in monarchs, this is kind of a vestigial organ. There's no good evidence that male monarchs use pheromones to attract females. And that was what I studied for the beginning of my career in monarchs, so I'd be happy to talk about that at the end, but we'll just wait. A little bit about monarch, we won't talk about that right now, but anyway, these patches, here's the female, and I sort of hate to define females as lacking something that males have. So we have these patches that the males have, but the females have wider wing veins, so you see there's kind of more dark scales on the top of her wing veins than he has. Can you see that? And a little bit of more brown scales in between these cells on the wings. The abdomens are shaped differently as well. On average, males are a little bit bigger than females, but it's kind of two bell curves and there's a ton of overlap. So you can't tell a male versus a female from looking at the size of one butterfly. Okay, so there's the male and female. The adult monarchs are generalists, as are almost all butterflies. They're generalists for getting nectar. They'll use nectar from a lot of different flowers. And because monarchs are here for a long time, where some butterflies will only have one generation, so they only need host plants during a certain portion of the summer, monarchs need access to nectar throughout the whole time that they're up here, which is from May through September and even into October. So to support monarchs, we need more than just milkweed. We need the food for the adults too, because they're long-lived and they need nectar to realize their full potential for their lifespan. And they especially need nectar at this time of the year, because the monarchs that are migrating to Mexico right now have to eat along the way. They're storing up energy that they're going to use to keep them alive all winter long. There isn't enough food for them in the overwintering sites in Mexico, so they absolutely need milkweed while they're down there. And they need energy stored up, and they get that from the nectar they get from these flowers. So I kind of have a circle here representing different species of nectaring flowers that they'll use as adults, and I'm a big proponent of native plants, so don't get mad at me for this lilac, which is definitely not a native plant, but there aren't that many flowers blooming in the spring when lilacs are blooming. If you're a gardener, you know that. And monarchs will nectar from lilac plants. So leaving some lilacs, having lilacs in your yard, they like nectaring from dandelions. So there are more non-native things available in the spring. We tend to kind of focus on summer and late summer plants when we do prairie restorations. So put some lilacs in. And then kind of going into the summer with the coneflowers, the nectar from bee balm, even though that's mostly a bee species, butterflies will use it too. Here's Joe Pyeweed and Black-Eyed Susan, getting into the asters and the blazing stars. So the point is, if you want to help monarchs, you should have flowers available for them all summer long, as long as they're here. Okay, so that's the individual life cycle, when it works out right. And this is the annual cycle. So just like the individual part of their life cycle, the annual cycle also involves 4 parts. And I'm going to start with now, what's happening now. How many people have been seeing monarchs migrating? Yeah, if you've been outside, did you say lots? Yeah, it has been a good year for monarchs. I saw several roosting sites at the Arboretum, lots and lots of monarchs clustered together. So it's definitely a good year for monarchs, and you should be really seeing a lot of them right now. So this 4-part annual cycle involves migrating south, like they're doing right now, overwintering in Mexico for the eastern migratory population, then migrating back north and breeding. So we're just going to step through that cycle. So the monarchs right now they're just starting to see them kind of down here in the middle of the country. We're getting some reports down here, but most of the monarchs in the world right now are kind of in this, what I'm circling with the green dot here. And they're following these paths south. They're going to funnel through Texas. They'll start getting to Texas in kind of the second week in October. And then they'll keep flying into Mexico, into central Mexico, where they'll reach their overwintering sites. And these continuous lines mean that these are the same butterflies making this whole migratory flight. It's not a stepwise migration south. Some of them do stop along the Gulf Coast and other places in Texas and pull out of the migration and lay eggs there, and their offspring may or may not continue the flight. We don't really know what goes on there, but the vast majority of them just keep going, and those same butterflies, so the ones that you're seeing now, will end up, most of them, unless they get killed along the way, will end up in Mexico. So there are some variations here. So this is what we call the eastern migratory population. There's another fairly distinct, but not completely distinct population that migrates to sites along the coast of California. So they're represented by these arrows, and they're moving right now too. We do know that there's some interchange between these two populations. So this dotted line right here means that some butterflies that have been tagged in Arizona have been found in the Mexican overwintering sites. So there is interchange. The degree to which that happens in the spring, we don't really know. And then let's also look over here. So there are a lot of monarchs in the northeastern United States. We know that some of those migrate along the Atlantic coast. Then what we don't know is why some of them end up going into Florida. I personally think they just missed this turn to the west. Just like, oops, here I am in southern Florida. We know this happens. We've studied this in a lot of different ways, and there's a little line right down here in Florida. There are monarchs that move into that Florida population. There's a population down there that breeds all winter long. And those butterflies we call it the Florida population, and every year it gets an influx of butterflies that come down from the north. So they just keep breeding down there. Monarchs are in all of these islands as well. We know that some of these butterflies do go onto the islands. We don't know if they do that on purpose or they just get blown there. So there's this thing going on. There is this overwintering along the coast, but this is what most of them do. So I'm only showing the monarchs in North America in this map, but there are monarchs in other parts of the world. So there's pretty well-established populations in southern Spain and Portugal. It's a North American species. We don't know how they got to southern Spain and Portugal, but they did. Probably moved by people, but there's no record of that. Every once in a while, one shows up in England. How they get to England, nobody knows. There are well-established populations in Australia and New Zealand, Hawaii. So they have been moved probably by people at some point in our history, but we just don't know when that happened. Yes?
I have a question about where they end up in Mexico. The arrow point just kind of hits in the middle of Mexico, like around Guanajuato, but I just wondered, is there like a place where they sort of get to?
Yes. So they are going to a really small area. So do you know Mexican geography? Yeah, geography. Between the states of Michoacan and Mexico. And it's, if you know the capital of Michoacan, which is Morelia, or Zitácuaro, they're northeast of Morelia. So it's right, some of the colonies are in Mexico and some are in Michoacan. Yeah, so they're on about 12 different mountaintops when they're there.
So
Yes.
do all of the monarchs that you just mentioned migrate somewhere?
Great question.
And you mentioned Hawaii, because I'm trying to think, where would they migrate?
That's a really good question. So his question was, do all of the monarchs that in all different parts of the world migrate? So this kind of makes me hopeful about monarch populations, that we can take them, probably it's us that have taken them to all these places, and we plop them down in very different conditions, and somehow they make it. So in Hawaii, they don't migrate at all. In Australia, they migrate in response to drought. So they move, I always have to like shift upside down to think of Australia. In Australia, they migrate north because it gets dry in the southern part of Australia in the wintertime. So they migrate north for wetter conditions. In Portugal and Spain, they just stay there. They don't really move around very much. So they adapt when we put them in different places. They don't migrate, it seems, in the Caribbean islands. There are monarchs, a subspecies of monarchs, well, the Danaeus plexippus, which is the subspecies that we have up here, goes pretty far south into South America. There are populations there that don't migrate. There are monarchs in the way southern part, or further south in South America, that migrate up mountains. So they do all different things. But these are small populations relative to this.
And they're all in temperate climates, most of them, like Hawaii and Spain, no?
Well, Hawaii's not very temperate.
I'm warmer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. That is an excellent point. His question was, they're all moving to, we put them in warmer climates, and those are the places they've survived. Yeah, if you've read the book Flight Behavior by Barbara Kingsolver, anybody read that book? Yeah, so that has monarchs. In that book, monarch populations can't overwinter anymore in Mexico because the forests are destroyed and the climate is bad for them. She has them overwintering in the Appalachian Mountains, which probably wouldn't happen. It's unlikely that they would go from here that way, but who knows what they would do. It's fiction, right? You can do anything. Right. Yes.
Where's the origin of the monarch butterfly? Where do they think the most indigenous and far back?
Great question. So her question is, what is the origin? So we know that they're a New World species. They evolved in North America, but they evolved in warm part of North America. So we think what happened is, and you can kind of see that just looking at this map. So if we have this butterfly that evolves down here, where a lot of their close relatives are, and there's competition for scarce resources, which there is for almost all species. If there are genes that make those butterflies move north in the summer and they keep going further and further north, and when this was happening, this was all one big prairie up here, this whole area. So the butterflies that move north would have a lot more resources available to them. It's just so little here. There's all these mountains which aren't so good for monarchs, so there's just a little bit of habitat for them here. And this was all perfect habitat. But they never evolved the ability to overwinter in our winters. So they have to go back in the wintertime. Yes?
I have another question, and that is, with all the floods and all of all the things happening, what's happening to the monarchs as they go down now with all the hurricanes that are disrupting?
Right, so that's a great question. She said, what's happening with all of the bad weather? And monarchs can kind of hunker down. They can find a place, hold on to trees, and wait for good weather. They won't move when it's raining, they won't move when it's dark. So unless the conditions just wipe out all the trees, so really, really terrible conditions would be bad for them. But they have encountered hurricanes several times during their migration in Texas, and it really hasn't had a big impact on them. They just wait it out. Okay, one more here and then we'll move on.
Well, that's the president, don't let him back there.
Well, the question was, what if the president doesn't let him back? If there was a wall, I think they'd be able to fly over that. Just in case there was a wall. Okay, so we got them to Mexico. They've crossed the border. The Mexican president let them in. Okay, so they get to Mexico. Now we're going to go to the second stage, overwintering. They just stay there. They just go hang out. They'll start arriving there at the end of October, all the way through November, because this migration just keeps going. I saw a caterpillar at the Arboretum on Monday. So there are still caterpillars up here. They're not going to be adults for 2 or 3 weeks, so that they get, their chances of making it are smaller than the ones that are migrating now, but some of them will make it down there. So they're arriving all through November. They stay there all winter long until the middle of March. Then those very same butterflies start back, but they don't make it all the way back. They come into kind of the southeastern quarter of the United States, move north, move across to the east. We don't know if any go south into Florida. It's really hard to tell. They get as far as kind of Kansas across, and then it's their offspring, that's why I made these lines broken. So their offspring continue the flight back here, and they recolonize most of the breeding range. It's not a complete stepwise migration. They don't just keep going further and further and further north. This generation that comes from the south pretty much covers their whole breeding range. And then they go through 2 to 3 non-migratory generations who don't show directional flight. And there have been a lot of experiments done on that. Those adults will just fly every which way. They're not flying in any direction. So some keep going further north, but they're not doing that, to move further north. So we go through these 2 to 3 more generations. If it's a really warm summer and there are a lot of butterflies, just by random chance, we get butterflies moving further north into Canada. They've been reported way up here, but they don't usually get there in most summers. So we have these 2 to 3 generations, and then the last generation of the year, the ones that we're seeing now, are the ones that will migrate. And the cycle then starts again. So these migratory butterflies that you're seeing right now, this last generation of the year, looks the same. Well, if you measured a lot of them, they'd be slightly redder. Their wing aspect, their wings would be a little bit longer in proportion to their width. They have a little slight change dimensions on their wings, but you can't tell that from looking at just one. It's just, you look and measure a lot of them, they're slightly big, with longer wings and redder wings. But they also, if you killed them and dissected them, the males would have very small ejaculatory ducts. I've measured them. And the females would not have eggs. So they're physiologically immature. They look the same on the outside, but they're not reproductive at that point. And they're in a condition that's called diapause. So all insects have a diapause, or all insects in a temperate climate, there is a time that they can't reproduce. So they might diapause as eggs. It just means they stop their development or really slow it way down. They might overwinter as eggs, larvae, pupae. Monarchs overwinter as adults. They just don't do it here. But they're not reproductive. It's called an adult diapause. So these butterflies that do this migration are different on the inside than the ones in the summertime. They have no desire to mate or lay eggs, and that won't happen until spring for most of them. All right. So one of the reasons that we know so much about how monarchs are doing is because they overwinter in these clusters in Mexico and California where we can count them. So we can assess the size of the population of this insect that covers a huge, huge area, which is a really hard thing to do. So in Mexico, we measure the area that they occupy, the area covered with trees, covered with monarchs. And in California, people actually count the individual butterflies. Now, I'm not going to talk very much about this generation because I spend most of my life with this generation, but the California population is doing really badly. Their numbers are down, way, way, way down. We're not sure they can recover, actually. This population is doing a little better, and I'll show you some numbers about that. Okay, so let's just really quickly think about what monarchs need during all these stages. So the monarchs that right now that are migrating south, I already told you they need nectar. They have to have nectar. This is ironweed. They need roosting sites at night. This is a mesquite tree, but I just saw the same thing in the Arboretum on Saturday night. Clusters of monarchs like this. People are seeing huge clusters of monarchs right now. So they need a place to stop at nighttime, they need nectar plants, and they need the right weather conditions that keep them going south. The south wind is bad for them right now. And what's interesting is they'll hunker down if there's a really terrible south wind, they just won't try to fly. They only weigh as much as a paper clip, so a paper clip getting blown by a strong wind is not going to make it. What they'll do with wind is they'll find, because the wind isn't consistent at all different altitudes, so if there's a strong wind, they'll stay close to the ground. If there's a north wind that's really favorable, they'll find where it's the best and they'll just get up and coast. So they find the elevation or the altitude that's best for flight. And there was this guy named David Gibault who was a hang glider and a monarch biologist, and he saw them up 2 kilometers in the air. You can't use your binoculars to see that high, so that kind of helped us understand how they really do take advantage of air currents. Once they get to Mexico, they don't really do much. They just hang out in the trees like this cluster. Sometimes you do see big flights of them flying up in the air, but for the most part, they just sit there. If there are flowers, you'll see them trying to nectar from those flowers, but that nectar is gone pretty quickly. So the millions of monarchs that are there can't all get food. As they're moving north, again, they need nectar, just like as they're moving south. So here's my lilac plant again. And they basically move north with the milkweed. So this picture was taken in Oklahoma. This is Asclepias viridis. And here's a female that found that little tiny milkweed plant, and she's laying an egg on it. And then they get up here. For these 2 to 3 generations, the population just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger throughout the course of the summer. So they need the milkweed for laying eggs, and the caterpillars to eat, and they need more nectar plants, and then the cycle starts again. So there's our whole cycle. This is like a chain. A chain is obviously only as strong as its weakest link. Everything on there needs to happen in order for monarchs to survive. But I spend most of my time up here with monarchs. I go to Mexico almost every winter, and because I study monarchs as caterpillars and eggs for the most part, when I look at these monarchs hanging in a tree, what I see is all of these individual monarchs that are amazing survivors. Because those of you that have looked at monarch caterpillars out in the wild, you'll see them one day, you go back the next day, they're gone. The survival from egg to adult is about 3%. It's very, very low. So these guys represent the survivors, and then they made the migration. A female can lay 500 eggs or more, so 2 or 3% is more than going to replace her. But again, these are the ones that survive. So I look at these and think, wow, they have amazing stories. And then I think those stories, the vast majority of those stories started here in the upper Midwest, where we have milkweed available for them. So it is a chain, but that chain starts here every year. This is it. We have a lot of responsibility up here when it comes to helping save monarchs. Okay, there's the biology. So now we're going to move on this is what people are interested in monarchs, and this has had very interesting consequences, people's interest in monarchs. I already talked about citizen science a little bit, but I'll mention that again. So here you see this delightful young college student who is so happy that she found this monarch caterpillar right there. Just she's exuding happiness. Okay, so monarchs are the state butterfly or insect of 7 states. More than 10% of the states in our union have monarchs as their state insect. Here they all are. In Wisconsin, we don't have a state butterfly or insect, so maybe we should make it. I was in Minnesota when this law was passed in 1998 when Jesse Ventura was our governor. And I like to kind of feel like I was a little bit responsible for this because I have a course that we offered in my lab for teachers every year, and we had a 4th grade teacher from the town of Matamidi, Minnesota, who I guess in 4th grade they learned how a bill becomes a law. And she went back to her class and said, "What would you like to be a law?" And the students said they want monarchs to be the state butterfly. And they talked to their representative, and he brought this bill up to the House in Minnesota, and it went all the way and became a law in 1998. So that was pretty cool. I don't know the story in all these other states, but I do know the Minnesota story. So this was also very important for a lot of the things that are going on with monarch conservation right now. In 2014, February of 2014, President Obama and President Peña Nieto and Prime Minister Harper met in Toluca, Mexico, not far from where the monarchs overwinter, and they did not agree on many things. They talked about free trade and the Keystone Pipeline and immigration, all things that are pretty contentious between those 3 countries. But they agreed on one thing. They agreed to create a working group to study ways to protect the monarch butterfly. Really, those 3 guys talked about protecting monarch butterflies. And when that happened, those of us in the monarch world, you know, just doing our thing, all of a sudden the whole world was thinking about monarchs. So that was pretty exciting. President Obama came back and issued a memorandum that said all of the federal agencies, the State Department, the Highway Department, had to do things to help monarch butterflies and pollinators. So that was really exciting. That got all the federal agencies involved. So all of a sudden, all these people from the USGS, the Bureau of Land Management are saying to us, how can we help monarchs? And we had a lot of ideas for them. So that was big, all this government involvement in conservation. Another thing that's very important that because people are interested in monarchs, we have all these data from citizen monitoring programs. So this is kind of a rough picture of what I talked about before, these 4 generations, or 4 stages of the migration, getting to Mexico and breeding and everything. And there are programs studying every single one of these stages of the life cycle. So this list is not the individual things that are important in here, it's just the length of them. The top programs, so the first 5 bullets here, are programs where butterflies in general are monitored. So we use a lot of data from those programs to figure out what's going on with monarchs, because they look at monarchs in addition to all the other butterflies. All these great, we're just starting a butterfly monitoring network in Wisconsin right now. There's a Wisconsin Butterflies website. And then all these other projects are specific to monarchs. So we can pull data from all of these projects and learn how monarchs are doing. This program is, and I'm not going to talk about the details of all of these. Eric mentioned the Monarch Larva Monitoring Project, which we started almost 25 years ago at the University of Minnesota. That's now jointly run by the Arboretum and the Monarch Joint Venture. But this is another program, Journey North. How many people in here have heard of Journey North who submitted data? They do a lot of bird stuff. I know Audubon people really like birds. Journey North tracks a lot of birds. Hummingbirds, we're tracking the migration of hummingbirds. But this is what one of our maps of monarch data looks like. So each one of the dots on this map represents a person reporting their first monarch. They see their first monarch of the year, and they report it to the website. And we have how monarchs move every year. So we see them, so this is actual data from this spring, getting them pretty much all the way north. That's kind of the map I showed you before, into Canada. All these are sightings in Canada. But you can see, here are the ones in the south that came back from Mexico. Here are their offspring. Up here, we have some volunteers in the West Coast, but mostly it's people tracking this migration. And you can imagine what we can learn from that by comparing the data from one year to the other, how fast they come, how many people see them, where they go first, where they go later. So this is just an incredible treasure trove of data that have been used a lot of times to show how monarchs respond to annual changes in weather conditions and other things. So that's a great citizen science project, Journey North. You can easily find it online. Another thing people do is create habitat for monarchs. So we have people that are putting habitat in nature centers, in their backyards. This is a CRP, or a field at a nature center. This is a national forest in Upper Michigan. And people are creating and protecting this habitat, but they're also learning from this habitat. So this is one of our volunteers from Mosquito Hill Nature Center, a woman named Jessica Miller, who's doing this for many years. And because of this project, she knows what's going to be a good year for monarchs, because she's out there looking at it every year. And she said she found best milkweed this year at this site since 2005. She reported this last summer. Lots of rain, lots of sun, and lots of heat make for a great field of milkweed. So the citizen scientists are providing data, but they're also learning what's good for monarchs. They're putting up signs. So here's a sign. This is a site that's a Monarch Larva Monitoring Project site. This person just made this site on his own. It's a really nice metal sign that's up at his Monarch Larva Monitoring Project site, so people can learn, passersby can learn what's going on. Okay, so hopefully I've convinced you. You probably didn't need convincing that people like monarchs. People will do a lot to help monarchs. So now we're going to get to the sad part of the talk. Despite this, all of this interest, monarch numbers are declining. So this is kind of a preview. It sounded like your next talks were kind of depressing too, about declining monarch or insect numbers and climate change and its impact on forests. So here's the depressing part of this talk. Despite all this interest, monarch numbers are declining. So I told you that in Mexico, for our eastern population, the butterflies that we have right here in Wisconsin, they go to Mexico. We measure the area that they occupy. So here's a tree covered with monarchs. This is the trunk of a tree in Mexico. The area filled with trees, filled with monarchs. And it's measured in hectares because it's Mexico, and a hectare is about 2.4 acres. So you can do the math, but you can just, it really doesn't matter how many. It is just how much it varies from year to year. So what we see here is this overall downward trend. You don't really need statistics to tell you this is a downward trend. But there's lots of year-to-year variation. This is going up and down. And we have enough data here to kind of tell us what are good monarch years, what leads to up years, what leads to down years. And weather is a very important driver. Yes?
What's the horizontal line?
The horizontal line, thank you, is that long-term average. So the long-term average of this is, if we take all these numbers and average them together, the long-term average is 5.7 hectares. And this goes up to last year. So these numbers are the start year, so this is the winter of 2018 and 2019. So we got up here above the long-term average. We are 6.01 hectares last year. But what we really need to do here to see what's going on is we can look at decade averages. So if we look at the last decade, even if we count this year, the last decade of overwintering area is 2.7 hectares. The decade before that was 6.4 hectares. It's more than a 50% decline. So some people say, I get a lot of reporters who come to me and say, I hear the population has declined by 95%. Well, 95% is if you take this year and compare it to that year. That's not really fair. But it's still, I say it's over a 50% decline. You can say whatever you want, but it is a big, significant decline. I think, I don't really like to make predictions, we are probably going to be, you know, somewhere around this average, between 5 and 6 hectares, maybe more this winter. We don't really know yet, because we don't know how their fall is going to go as they migrate. But, you know, this is a big change, and I have been going to Mexico to study, and this was the first year I went. So I got to see that, which was amazing. I was also there this year, so it's huge. I mean, this area, this 0.67 hectares, that's a little bigger than a football field. So we could have squeezed all the monarchs from the whole eastern population into a football field. So it is a big and significant decline. So we have enough data now to kind of try to figure out what leads to these declining numbers. And we can easily see that a decline in the availability of breeding habitat is associated with this declining population. Now this is correlation, and we've all learned correlation doesn't equal causation. We're not doing experiments. You know, we only have a sample size of 1 for this experiment. We have this Earth. We're doing this big experiment with a sample size of 1, which is a bad way to do science, but it's what we have. So all we can really do is look at correlations. We can do studies in the lab, look at the mechanistic explanations for these things, but in the end, we know that breeding habitat loss is associated with this declining population. Makes sense. Less area to breed, smaller population. So, where are we losing habitat? We're losing habitat in a lot of ways, and I don't need to really, I'm sure all of you kind of know your examples of this. In the United States, we're losing over 5,000 acres of land a day for real estate and energy development. This information is no longer available on the Farm Service Agency website. I keep looking. But I could get it for 2011 to 2012 from them in 2013, and they stopped putting this information up there. But in this year, 400,000 acres of non-crop land were converted to cropland. And this is kind of small, but here we see, so this was data compiled in this year, the last year they collected this information, or at least the last year they made it public. And here we have in Wisconsin, new land that was broken out for agriculture, 11,000 acres. And all of this land that was lost contained milkweed and nectar plants. So, you know, we can think about this and we can be really depressed about it, but sometimes I'm happy I studied monarchs instead of something like wolves or whooping cranes or spotted owls. Because we can look at this and say, no spotted owl is going to live here, no wolf, but monarchs could live here. There is still some green left here. Most of it's Kentucky bluegrass and wouldn't support anything, but it could. That habitat could be changed. So that's when I get up on the right side of the bed. I look at things like that and think there's still hope. So another big thing that happened, and this is not even included in all the statistics I gave you on the last slide, is there has been a huge change in agricultural practices. Not the amount of land in ag, but ag practices that have led to a decline in habitat for monarchs. And this is from what we call herbicide tolerant crops, so genetically modified crops that can withstand the application of herbicide. So like Roundup ready crops. In 2000, we did a big study. We went out, it was a big collaborative study. A whole bunch of people went out into corn and soybean fields and other kinds of habitat. And because we found a lot of milkweed, here's a cornfield with milkweed growing in it. This is a soybean field with milkweed. We found a lot of milkweed. We measured how much monarchs were using this milkweed. And not because this is amazing monarch habitat, but just because there's so much corn and soy land out there. We estimated that about 50 times more, not 50% more, but 50 times more monarchs came out of ag fields than other kinds of habitat. And now, all that habitat is gone because farmers can now apply herbicide after the crops come up. So here's a soybean field, here's a little milkweed plant right here, and a whole bunch of other things there. But that milkweed is dead. For a while, milkweed kept coming back, but now it's pretty much gone. There are a lot of weeds that have become resistant to Roundup, but not milkweed. So it's gone. This habitat that led to 50 times more monarchs is not available to them anymore. So this is, who would have thought I'd be interested in herbicides? But it's something I keep following. I'm kind of a glutton for punishment. But there are new kinds of herbicide-tolerant crops on the market. Just this year, this new kind of genetically modified crop called Enlist E3 that comes out of Dow DuPont. It's sold soybeans, corn, and cotton, and this is a crop that can withstand 3 kinds of herbicides, 2,4-D, glyphosate, and glufosinate. And because of this, the USDA is estimating that there's going to be a 200 to 600% increase in 2,4-D application by 2020. And Monsanto, that made Roundup-ready crops, which were resistant to Roundup, which is glyphosate, made a new one that came on the market in 2016 called Extend, and that can withstand dicamba and glyphosate. So they're going to just keep developing crops. So, I think for the time being, we kind of have to think of this agricultural land is not going to be available to monarchs until we in the United States change food production. But that's not going to happen overnight. We need to hang on until that happens. Okay, so why are corn and soybeans important? Corn and soybeans, this you can't really see this, but this is the amount of land in all of these different counties. So basically, this is the corn belt, this is corn, this is soybeans, and this is also monarch breeding habitat. So they used to have all this land available to them, but they don't anymore. So that's breeding habitat loss, and we know that monarch numbers are associated with the loss of this habitat. We don't see a correlation between monarch habitat loss and the overwintering sites, but there is loss there. The government is protecting it, but there's still some removal of logs, large-scale logging. This is an area, this mountain is called Cerro Pelon, and this was logged off right in here. Monarchs used to overwinter right there. Here's a tree that was cut down right in an area where there are monarchs. There's both this large-scale logging and then small-scale logging that people are taking firewood out of the area. So there is habitat loss there. And then other factors. So insecticides. So when your neighborhood gets sprayed for mosquitoes, those are not just killing mosquitoes. Those sprays kill insects. They're insecticides, not mosquiticides. So mosquito sprays, neonicotinoids, which are herbicide or insecticides that go in all of the tissues of plants. Climate change, so this caterpillar was killed in a study we did where we picked milkweed leaves in areas that were sprayed for mosquitoes, and this caterpillar died as a result of eating that. And that was those leaves were toxic for 2 weeks after they applied the spray. They stopped stopping mosquitoes 3 days after applying the spray. Climate change is another one. This picture was taken in the overwintering colony, so climate change can impact monarchs anywhere, but climate change actually in the overwintering sites is predicted to lead to more frequent storms in the winter time. This picture was taken in the winter of 2002, February of 2002, when there was a big storm that killed 80% of the monarchs. And climate change models predict more frequent storms like this. There are, and it's kind of like all the things that hurt species, pesticides, climate change, invasive species. This is kind of an interesting one. This is a species, this is a parasitoid fly. The female fly, this is of species that doesn't have a common name. This is its scientific name, Compsylura consonata. This was introduced on purpose to kill gypsy moths. It kills a lot of silk moths as well. Here's a picture from the hungry caterpillar with kind of showing you how it grows in there. These are the maggots of this fly, which hook onto the tracheae of the monarchs and get air from that and soak in nutrients from the monarch when it's eating, and they always kill it, so it's called a parasitoid. So this was, it's become invasive. It's introduced on both coasts, moved in. Okay, we're done with the sad part of the talk. Good. So, what do we do about this? We have good science. How do we use what we know about monarchs to stop this decline and at the same time to help other species? So one thing, this whole group of scientists did this big modeling effort to look at all the things that were driving monarch populations. The biggest thing correlated with the decline in monarch numbers was loss of breeding habitat. We know where we've lost that breeding habitat. Where do we find more opportunities for breeding habitat? So we looked at the potential for all different kinds of habitat. One is urban and suburban spaces. So we think of places where people live, work, and play. And there are a lot of flat lawns in the places where we live, work, and play. Now it's more fun to play croquet and for kids to run around on grass. But there's a lot of grass that gets mowed and mowed and mowed, and people never use it. So this is my house in Minnesota. This was my yard. It was a big prairie. This is what we could do in our lawns. We can put these nectar plants, we can put milkweed for the monarchs, and I have a lot of monarchs that came to my yard. My neighbors love seeing the monarchs and all the other butterflies, but none of them did this. So, oh well. So we could do this, but unfortunately, this is what a lot of lawns look like. This picture was taken, I took this last year in Kalamazoo, Michigan, a new housing development. There's no habitat there for anything. So we can get land in our urban and suburban spaces. Anyone can do that. We can get agricultural set-aside land. So this is land that was farmed and it's pulled out of production. It could be CRP land, any ag set-aside land. This is a program that they have in Iowa called the STRIPS program, where they're putting habitat that was actually designed to control erosion and to improve water quality. But you can put milkweed and nectar plants in these areas. Now, we have concerns about pesticide drift into these areas, but if you've been in Iowa recently, there aren't a lot of options. And this might not be great habitat, but it's probably better than nothing. So survival might be lower here, but if there's any survival, it's better than not having any habitat for monarchs. So this is a possibility. So, this is a newspaper article from Iowa City and Cedar Rapids this summer that talks about these STRIPS programs where they're putting in this habitat. This is a soybean field, yeah. Okay, so we're kind of going the wrong way in this direction though. So this is a study done by a colleague of mine at the University of Wisconsin, and this is 10 by 10 kilometer squares in the United States, and the red squares on this map are areas where agricultural land has expanded, the really dark red by up to 10%. This is where agricultural land has been abandoned, the blue colors on this map. So if we look at the whole United States, in this time period from 2008 to 2016, 10 million acres 10 million new acres of land were put into agricultural production. 3.5 million were abandoned, so the net change here is 6.5 million. Acres were moved from non-ag into ag. Yes?
When you say abandoned, do you mean
Cropland.
just left unused at all, or do you mean put into housing production?
Both. Oh, no, it's not put into housing production. It's cropland that is still open, but it's not, yeah, and it can be anything. It can just be fallow, or it can be land that has, new land that's been put into a CRP program. Yeah, way back.
Well, what about solar farms, such as in the town of Saratoga in Wood County? They're putting in a 1,600-acre solar farm.
So solar farms, that's an interesting one. He said, what about solar farms? So there actually is a very tight partnership going on right now between the solar industry and the monarch/pollinator conservation world. Because if you look at these solar farms, there's actually quite a lot of space between the rows. And all of those big solar developers, or not all, but most of them, and in Minnesota, there's actually a law that they have to work with pollinators. So there's a big move to put pollinator habitat in there, which actually decreases the costs. They used to mow all that. So they're really working. I mean, obviously, it can't be really tall plants, so they have to be careful about the species they put in there. But they are working. So in my opinion, a solar farm is better for pollinators and monarchs than a cornfield. That's my opinion. Okay. So this is what's happening. So this is kind of the source of the information in that Lark et al. Study. So here we have, this is a very messy graph, I apologize, but there's just a few interesting things that I want to point out here. The green bars on this map, and this information came from the Extension Service in Illinois, but it's national. The data are national. So this green bar is CRP. So there was a conservation reserve program. It kind of died out in the 70s and early 80s. Came back in. So this is the amount of land that was under CRP contract, Conservation Reserve Program contract, where farmers were being paid money by the federal government for land that had been cropped that they pulled out of production for conservation purposes. So we peaked with the CRP in the like 2007, I think is the peak here. And this number has steadily declined. It's down about a third now from its peak, so there isn't as much money available to pay farmers, so CRP land is getting pulled out of contract. And this is the loss. This is most of that loss that we've seen of land that was cultivated in this period. So here's this period of the study that I showed you, 2008 to 2016. Just going down, and what it's getting put into, these are all different major crops in the United States. The ones that are increasing here are corn and soybeans. So the orange is soybeans, and the blue is corn. So for a while we were pretty even with corn and soybeans. With ethanol, it's easier to make ethanol out of corn, so that really increased. So that's where it's going. We can also, we have that possibility with ag land, but it's not really what's happening. Rights of ways, roadside rights of ways, railroad rights of ways, utility line rights of ways are all possibilities, and those are in some ways pretty nice habitat because they're linear. They can get monarchs from one big habitat to another. This picture was taken on a roadside in Minnesota. So rights of ways are a good possibility. We have some concerns about rights of ways because they're often right next to busy roads. They sometimes get mowed, and there might be milkweed and monarchs on that milkweed, but it is a possibility as long as it's managed correctly. Protected lands, here's land that is already protected. We don't need to worry about it, but we can get more habitat if we manage these protected lands more effectively. Unfortunately, if we look at a map of protected lands in the United States, so here we have the Corn Belt where most monarchs are produced. There is not a lot of protected land. This is state, county, federally protected land. There's some little dots of it, but not very much protected land. There's a lot out west which can't be farmed, so that's why we protected all this land. But we didn't protect the land that was good for farming very effectively. And finally, and I'm not going to go into the details on the numbers here, but we do not achieve our monarch conservation goals without this. And this is land, you saw this everywhere in Wisconsin this spring. This was a familiar sight, right? You drove around, you saw a lot of fields that looked like this. This is what we call marginal agricultural land. This is a real term that the USDA uses. It's basically land that's economically less productive because things like this happen to it. And this farmer was not going to make any money on this crop except through crop insurance this year. So the reason that this marginal land is farmed, and this is a lot of the land that's being newly put into agriculture. It was not an ag for a reason. It's not highly productive land. So if we could pull some of this marginal ag land that really shouldn't be farmed, we would achieve our conservation goals with monarchs. We need this. So we can plug away in all of these different areas. And you know, I'm a conservation biologist. That's my field, my professional field. Sometimes when you're a conservation biologist, you just know all these horrible problems out there. These are all your speakers that are coming to tell you all these sad stories. Sometimes it's a little hard to be happy when you know all these bad things going on. But I am kind of a Pollyanna-ish kind of person in some ways. So my field requires hope. You know, but there's got to be a reason to get out of bed in the morning. So this list gives me hope. And these are programs that are happening on an international level and in each of the North American countries that are helping to protect monarchs and other species. And I'm just going to say a few words about the Monarch Joint Venture, which is many, many organizations all over the country that are working collaboratively to figure out how to protect monarchs and what to do. And I'm happy to say that the University of Wisconsin Arboretum is a new member of the Monarch Joint Venture. And here we have, this is actually a little old, we're getting so that it's hard to fit all of the logos on. But these are all the different organizations, and I've circled in red the ones that are in Wisconsin. So we have our nice share of different organizations in Wisconsin working on monarch conservation. But all of these programs, some of them are big, like the USGS, the Park Service, the Fish and Wildlife Service, and the Field Museum in Chicago. But then there's a lot of little tiny, like Great Parks of Hamilton County. This is a county in Pennsylvania. A little nature center in Texas that have joined this, and they're learning what they can do to protect monarchs. If you want to find out a lot about monarchs, you can just Google Monarch Joint Venture, and you'll find all sorts of cool things about monarchs. But this gives me hope that all these organizations are working together on monarch conservation. So, what can you do if you're interested in helping monarchs? Here are my big 4 things. You can create habitat. That's the most important thing you can do. By creating habitat, you're not only going to help monarchs, you're going to help a lot of other species as well, including birds. Birds eat bugs. Bugs need habitat. You can contribute to Monarch Citizen Science, Journey North, Monarch Larva Monitoring Project. There's all sorts of them. It's easy to find out about them. You can support conservation organizations. Donate money to Audubon. Donate money to your local nature center, to the Monarch Joint Venture, anything that is working to preserve habitat. They all need money to do their great work. And you can help spread the word. You can take what you've learned here and go out and talk to your friends and neighbors, because like the title of my talk said, it takes all of us working together. It's got to be an all hands on deck approach to helping monarchs. Not the end. To continue, you need to log on using the There, here we go. I can do it manually. All right, so here's kind of the little pep talk, and this is the last little slide. And I said in the beginning, you know, I'm in this because I think monarchs will convince people to do great things for conservation. And what's amazing about them is they exist in this mosaic of rare and pristine habitat, native prairies, remnant prairies. You know, we've lost all but 1% of our remnant prairies, and monarchs use that habitat. But they also use common and disturbed habitats. They used to be in cornfields. There's nothing more disturbed than a cornfield. And these habitats are shared with many other species, except cornfields were not shared with a lot of species. They're an incredibly interesting organism from which we still have a lot to learn, like how they find those overwintering sites in Mexico. And their migration is an unmatched biological phenomenon. There is not another insect that migrates like monarchs. It turns out there's a dragonfly that lives in Asia that migrates a little farther than monarchs, but it's not as regular and organized as monarchs, going from this vast area to this small overwintering area in Mexico. So I have a colleague, Lincoln Brower, who died 2 years ago, and he would compare the monarch migration to the Mona Lisa. And he said, why do we care about saving the Mona Lisa? You know, why do we care about saving monarchs? Because they are just amazing, as is the Mona Lisa. I would agree. So, here's my contact information. You are welcome to contact me. You can just Google me, or you can remember Kay Oberhauser. You can find a lot of information at the Monarch Joint Venture, and I would be happy to answer any more questions that you have. And thank you for your attention. Okay, lots of questions, and I saw your hand first.
I'm wondering if you wanted to observe what's happening right now, where you can push yourself to be a good condition somewhere in Wisconsin to see or roost or something like that.
So, her question was, where would you go if you wanted to see monarchs right now? Well, you could come to the Arboretum in Madison. You guys are all Audubon. There is an amazing place just north of Madison called Goose Pond. It's owned by the Madison Audubon Society in Columbus, I believe. And it is, I was there a couple weeks ago, but they're seeing roosts of 15,000 monarchs right now. So Goose Pond Sanctuary and Audubon site. I don't know of reports up here, but if you want to find monarchs at nighttime, you should find a field that has a lot of monarchs in it in the daytime and just go watch where they go. Because really are a lot of them around right now. This is going to be a good year for them. Yes?
Could you talk a little bit more about different types of ag fields and whether they provide much monarch habitat? I understand what you're saying about Roundup Ready or Enlist or whatever. If it's sprayed with that, there's not much left in terms of native plants. But what about animals that are raised by grazing rather than fed corn and soybeans? Or what about organic fields, or even like smaller crops that haven't been genetically modified, whether it's oats or wheat or...
Yeah, that's an excellent question. The question was, what about other kinds of ag? And I focus on corn and soy just because there's so much corn and soy out there. But you raise a really good point, and we're working a lot with other kinds of agricultural producers, because an organic farmer is going to be very interested in habitat. They're interested in bees for pollination. So we're working a lot with the organic industry. Grazing is an interesting one, so you've raised a lot of possibilities. So orchards, another one. Orchards that don't spray in between the trees are a great source of habitat. Grazing is an interesting one. I was involved with a study at Minnesota before I came here, and I'm still working on papers from that study. So as long as grazing is done at lower, what's it called? There's a word for the number of grazers per acre or something, animal units per acre or something like that. That as long as there's not too much grazing, it's good, because agriculture or livestock will avoid milkweed plants unless there's nothing else available. So, but if there's too many of them, there aren't a lot of nectar plants available. So grazing is a good one. So yeah, a lot of possibilities in other kinds of ag. Yes.
We've converted more than half of our backyard from grass to native perennials, such as purple coneflower, black-eyed Susan, show pie weed, Culver's root, and sky blue aster, as much as possible natives to Wisconsin. And what I'd like to know is, we don't have any milkweed, and we've tried to bring in milkweed and we've been unsuccessful. Out of some of those that I just mentioned, should I try to promote some of those plants more than others?
all of those are good, and you have a range of flowering times for the plants
Sky blue aster
that you
right
listed.
now.
Right now, the sky blue aster. Monarchs really like blazing stars. They don't like the prairie blazing star. They like the Ligula stylus, aspera. They like the blazing stars where the flowers are kind of separate from each other. The prairie blazing star, the flowers are all really close. For some reason, that's not a huge favorite of them. So a lot of the clovers are good, the legumes, but those are good species. I would recommend for milkweed plants, you just gotta keep trying, and pretty soon they're gonna take. And then when they take, they're gonna start to take over. Common milkweed. But try is your yard dry or wet or sunny?
It's wet. It's pretty damp. We irrigate it, unfortunately.
So try swamp milkweed. Have you tried that?
Swamp milkweed,
Yeah,
no.
Asclepias incarnata. That'll be a good one to
Do you start from seed or do you start?
Depends on how much money you have.
Let's say it's not a whole lot of money.
And seeds are definitely cheaper than the plants.
Okay.
And they'll grow. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay, we'll go here and then there. Yes.
We have really poor soil. We started planting red milkweed and it just takes off like crazy. And they just love that.
Okay. So red milkweed is one that's kind of hard to get. Do you know the species name, the scientific name? There's a purple. Yeah, red milkweed might be swamp.
It's the same species.
Incarnata?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there's a purple milkweed, and there is something that some people call red milkweed. But, yep, whatever grows, that's a good one.
And then the butterfly.
Butterfly weed. Another good poor soil one is floral milkweed. That one will grow sort of like a common goat prairie milkweed.
What was that one?
Floral is spelled W-H-O-R-L-E-D.
Okay.
Yeah. You're back there and then here. Yes?
Are the caterpillars that feed on common milkweed more toxic to birds than the ones that you say swamp milkweed or some of the others that have less milkweed?
Yeah, that's a really great question. His question is, are the butterflies that feed on common milkweed less toxic than the ones that eat, or more toxic than the ones that eat other kinds of milkweed? So milkweed varies a lot across species and even within species in the chemical that makes the caterpillars toxic to birds and then the adults as well. And common milkweed is kind of on the low end of toxicity, but swamp milkweed is even lower on the scale of toxicity. So there is a relationship between the amount of milkweed or the amount of cardinalides, this toxic chemical, in the milkweed and the amount in the monarchs. It's a correlation, but it's not a perfect correlation, because what the monarchs can do is concentrate it in their bodies. So they're really good at concentrating the cardinalides from common milkweed, because that's probably the species that they have eaten the most over evolutionary time. So they are more toxic when they eat common milkweed than when they eat swamp milkweed, but then they're more toxic than common milkweed if they eat some other species like Asclepias viridis, which they get in the south. So there's a big variation in the amount of cardinalides. But what's interesting about that is birds don't taste them all. So as long as you look like a toxic monarch, it doesn't really matter how toxic you are, because the birds aren't going around nibbling. So that would only be a problem for them if they all ate the less toxic milkweed and the birds learned that they were okay. So that's a really interesting evolutionary dance between the predators and the monarchs. Yeah, right there.
Small question, what's your thought on the trade-off? Milkweed and other flowers being planted along busy highways?
Yeah, so that was another project I was involved with in Minnesota, and I'm working on some papers right now to write this up. So, okay, the trade-off. There is a trade-off. If in a perfect world there wouldn't be highways, but there are. In a perfect world there would be a lot of other habitat besides the habitat along the highways. But, you know, the problem is, when I drive through Iowa, and a lot of monarchs have to make it successfully through Iowa, there's not a lot of other habitat besides roadside. So we need that habitat. So, and some of the risks of roadside, I mean, there's the risk of collisions with cars, which is the one we think of. But probably greater risks are the toxins that come off of the roads, and also the stuff on the other side of those roadsides. There's a road on one side, there's a cornfield on the other side, they're spraying insecticides in that cornfield. So they're getting things from either side. They're putting salt on the roadside, heavy metals from brake liners. There's a lot more toxins in the soil right next to a place where vehicles stop. It's a lot worse where there's more traffic. So, you know, all roadsides are not created equal. You know, there are purists who say we shouldn't be promoting roadside habitat, but I'm more of a pragmatist, and in a lot of cases, that's all we can get. So, you know, we're working with departments of transportation to try to encourage roadside habitat in places where there isn't so much traffic, because it won't be so bad for the monarchs, and for maybe mowing, you know, the first meter or so, or 2 meters next to the roadside, depending on the width of the roadside, keeping that mowed so the area that's most toxic won't have milkweed on it. So there are ways to manage it to minimize the risks.
Folks, I think given the lateness of the evening, we're going to disperse at this point. However, there are snacks out on the sideboard. Karen has agreed to stay afterwards if you have any questions.